Welcome, everyone, to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm here with a dear friend of mine, Taylor Barrett, and he is the person who really introduced me to the practice of circling. He was one of the two facilitators, he and his partner, Joe. And since then, we've had ongoing communication and regular discourse. And I'm excited because Taylor is putting together a new course which picks up on a lot of themes that I've been recently working on, and I and Chris have been working on, and Guy and I have been working on. And so I'm just really excited to talk about this and to try and bring out not only what the course might offer, let's say practically. I don't like that adjective because it sounds too diminutive, but also sort of some of its philosophical, cultural pertinence and significance right now. So welcome, Taylor. Why don't you tell us again a little bit about yourself and how you and our work sort of it jives, and then we can get into the more particulars of the course, maybe start with some very basic stuff about it, when, where, how, and then we can unpack what it's doing, its relationship to the whole dialogos, I don't know if they call it movement, so again, it's just great that you're here. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, John. I really appreciate you offering to bring me on so that we can sort of talk about this. Yeah, so I've been sort of co-leading the Authentic Relating Toronto community for the past, well, leading for 6 years, but I'm involved in it. This is actually, I think, my 9th year now that I've been doing it. And it's been a community that's been working with a lot of authentic discourse, authentic relating practices, including circling. So I sort of picked it up from somebody else who created it a number of years back. They were sort of ready to move on. They got interested in a woman and wanted to focus on that. So they sort of left it to Joe and I to see what we wanted to do with it. And we picked it up and started developing some training courses and sort of expanding into sort of our perspective and our take on authentic relating and what we needed to do to further grow it in Toronto. So that had been primarily our focus for quite a while. Obviously, COVID has put a bit of a wrench in that. However, interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, sort of before I met you, but very much in line with what was happening sort of in the sphere and the field, as I call it. And I think we talked about this a bit before in our previous call, that there was a lot happening sort of in the sense-making sphere, a lot of discussion happening. And I'm listening to these discussions and I'm just sort of like thinking about where the next logical space of this conversation is going to go. And then like a moment later, it's there. And it's just like, whoa, this is like getting really trippy. So I was starting to really experience this collective intelligence sort of experience. And then, of course, being introduced to you and then starting to, start to watch your videos. And then it's like the same thing's happening here. So that's kind of when I reached out and said, like, hey, like there's this thing going on and I'm looking at sort of experimenting with some stuff. It seems really convergent with the work that you're doing. And that's sort of, we had already been doing the circling thing together, but this was sort of hearing what your interests were with circling, where it was working and what you wanted to see, where things were headed. And also for me, sort of having this experience of being so immersed in circling for so many years and then seeing myself in environments where I had to reach outside that and where that started to feel foreign to me. Like by trade, I'm a software developer. So I'm so stuck in logicality and problem solving. And it was so interesting after years of like deep intersubjective group work, then I find myself in these environments where we're starting to talk about things and I start to actually feel a bit awkward, like what used to be the water I was so used to started to feel really peculiar to me. And I started to sort of notice what I felt was missing in my authentic relating and circling, my ecology of practices, although I didn't know that, use that term at the time. And so it really led me to start creating some experiments about trying to blend in all three perspectives that are available to us at all times. That's being the I, the we, and the it or the its, using integral quadrant terminology. So, with circling and authentic relating being very strong on the I, the introspection, and the we, like the energy and what's happening between us, not spending a lot of time in the it or the it's, the systemic sort of objectives, external realm. And that seemed to be really in line with what you were kind of wanting, or what I perceive you were wanting from some of these circling experiences. Here's this really powerful method of discourse. And now what? What do we do with it? How can we use what's happening here to turn around and affect the things that were really important to you, and obviously were to me, but I wasn't working in that sphere of really trying to look at and solve a meaning crisis or try to address a meaning crisis. So I think, us sort of meeting and, colliding in that way, and the bunch of work that you've put out is just, it's really plugged in so well to the thing that was running in the background while I've been doing all this intersubjective work.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll evoke a Jungian term, but put some scare quotes around it without necessarily getting bound to particular metaphysics yet. I want to read Bernardo Kastrup's book on Jung's metaphysics but there's definitely this ongoing series of synchronicities between us that I really sort of cherish, and really bespeaks to me that there's something more going on here. And so, I mean, Chris and Guy and I, with help from a lot of people, have been, engaged in this dialectic into dialogos. And then you have been working on something that's deeply convergent with it. I'll say again, just so that I think of dialogos as a term for a family, right? It isn't just a specific, right? And dialectic into dialogos is one particular practice, and there's many, and how, and getting them to all form a community together is one of my extra propositional projects, if I can put it that way. So one of the things I'm very excited about, and I'm going to have some participation in, I'm hoping, and it looks like, is this new course in which you're trying to get this idea about, getting people, instead of having their perspectival awareness, their perspective first, second, or third, be transparent, transparent framing, getting them to not step outside of it, but to do that transparency opacity shifting that Polanyi, right, talks about in attention, and move into it and move out of it, and move and get an awareness of what it is to move between them, and then what does that do to our seeing and thinking, our seeing and conceiving. In fact, I more and more like the term conceiving rather than just thinking, because it brings with it the sense of giving birth to something. If we could get that old Socratic sense back, the midwifery sense. So I'm very excited about this. Can you lay out a little bit more, what's the basic structure of the course, and when will it be, and how can people get involved, etc.?
Yeah. So we'll be starting January 18th. It runs for 13 weeks. It was 12 weeks, but we've added a week thanks to you participating with it. And we've really built sort of a progressive scaffolding such that, well, you don't need to have to enter the course with a particular set of experiences. It will be helpful, but we're also setting it up such that people don't have to feel lost. So we're starting off with some really basic exercises and practices, and we're adding complexity onto those as we go throughout the course. So in each session, we'll do a little bit on theory. We'll talk a little bit about and then we'll make that shift into practice, and then we'll come back in and debrief and move, and we'll keep checking in with the group. We're entering basically a fellowship together.
Right.
Sort of engage in this enacted play. For some of us, it'll be integrated. For others, but it'll be new. Some aspects of this will be new to some people. And there's going to be different areas where people are really strong in when they're, participating and working with these practices. And there's going to be some areas in which they're probably not as capable of. And those will be the areas where, it's going to be novel for them. And we'll sort of work on ways to sort of integrate that by using the theory and by using the experiential, as well as trying to sort of, I'll say, sense make our experience together as a group. So I think that's the general structure for how we're building it. It's a couple hours each week, although the first week will be a little bit longer because there's a lot of context to set up. and we'll have that space in between to sort of help integrate, as well as a little bit of partner work to sort of help people engage, without the facilitator is always there. So to have them sort of wrestle with it and struggle with it a little bit, and then come back in and debrief and see how that went. So yeah, this is the general structure. It's pretty experiential. And in many ways, it's also a bit of an experiment, because this is taking all of my years of sort of doing trainings on circling and doing immersions with circling and authentic relating practice, but also adding in this extra layer of complexity and starting to blend theory. Because when we do circling, when we do authentic relating, we don't talk about theory, we don't talk about structures. I think this is an important piece to help us sort of grok it, or help some of us grok it in a way which we might not be used to. Some of us are highly participatory, but we're lacking some of the procedural, and then some of us are very procedural, and we're sort of we're not really engaging with one another. So we're really sure about what we're sure of, but we've never actually put it into practice to sort of see, like, well, hang on a sec, what's my blind spot, what's my shadow here? So yeah, I think those are hopefully that does it decent justice.
So there'll obviously be some circling practices. What other practices might there be? Like some mindfulness practices, some shadow work practices. What are some of the kinds of practices that people will expect to see?
Exactly, that's it. We'll start with some very basic sort of connection-based exercises that tend to fall under the theme of authentic relating.
Right.
Generally, authentic relating, and traditionally the way it's executed is in the form of what are called games. Some communities call them experiments. But I've also seen that these, 5 to 30-minute exercises can be extrapolated out of the context of an authentic relating games night and put into a leadership development tool, because some of them are so amazingly potent. And you can continue to extract more and more nuance through your experience by just focusing. Like there's this one really basic exercise that we do, where we sort of invite people to look at their hand and just focus on their hand. And as they're focusing on their hand, they'll start to notice lines and colors, and things will shift with their shape. So it's just like, by putting our attention on even something basic like that, but guiding it, like, oh my God, there's so much more that we can notice this experience. So even though we say that they're basic, some of the starting ones are basic exercises, they're foundational to self-awareness, to working on that muscle of staying present with the here and now. So we'll do a number of those that'll be interspersed to help bolster a more complex practice, say like circling, or something known as T group, which comes from the 50s and 60s as a training group. And then we'll move into a practice that I developed after we last talked, which I call a collective intelligence campfire, which is sort of that attempt to start to merge those three perspectives into a facilitated dialogue. We'll of course have you come on and work with the dialectic into dialogos practice.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's the current broad ecology that we'll be working with over this course.
So exciting. So we'll put a link to like a website in this video, so people can reach it and find out the time, the logistics, and payment structure and stuff like that. So that's very exciting. So I mean, this is becoming so much the core of my work. Is the new way of seeing, and right, that Bartok talks about when he's he's sort of taking Goethe and phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty and right, and then I'm also reading Leek's book on Polanyi, Contact with Reality, and again this relearning. I mean, the word is not quite right. Relearning how to see and be again in really profound ways, and it's, for me, this is the level at which we've got to work if we're going to get out of, the meaning crisis, and if we're going to get to a place where we can seriously, deeply work together to address the meta crisis. Um, so I want to really, and I don't think this is inflationary at all. I think it's completely authentic. I want to really now try and unpack sort of the three levels of significance this might have for people, like the practical personal level, and then the philosophical sort of cultural spiritual level, and then potentially beyond that, or related to it, like the cultural level, if we could. So let's do the first level. And I don't want this to sound like some dry or sinister advertisement pitch, but what at that level, why, you got like 2 minutes. Why would somebody find this relevant at the personal level? In what way will it change which practices in their life, and in what way will it change those practices in some way? Does that make sense as a question, first of all?
Yeah, I'm trying to form the bridges in my mind to that, but I think I get what you're getting at. Like, what's the tangible impact? Like,
yeah, what's the tangible impact? Like, what's the transformation that is people can reasonably come to expect? And why would they find it's hard before transformation? And I get that's why this is not just advertising. That's why I caveated it. But there's, in a way, then instead of advertising, there's a promise being made. Let's take it that way. There's a transformation being offered, and there's a promise that you'll find that transformation valuable in some way. That's what I'm asking. What's the promise of the transformation, and what's the promise of how you might, not right now, because you have to go through the transformation, but how you might find that transformation valuable?
Yeah. Well, I think the best way for me to articulate it is I sort of see this as a culmination of everything that I've been working on, even for myself over the past number of years. So I can speak from my experience of sort of what I've gotten out of immersing myself into this world.
Right.
So, I mean, the anecdote that I tend to tell is that before I got into sort of this interpersonal, personal development group work, I could see myself as a bit of a misanthrope. I didn't like people. In fact, I basically externally blamed everybody else around me for all the pain and suffering that I was experiencing. And what I've come to realize, or what's happened through that, is all the projections that I was making onto other people, I could start to see what's mine and what's theirs. I can start to create more ease in what was, I wasn't even aware of it, but what was a fairly anxious system. So the interesting thing for me is that I don't experience very much anxiety anymore. There's a relaxation in my being of having explored these group practices with people. There's a way in which I have more space, and it takes time, but there's a way in which I have more space to consider, internally introspect, also see like what's important to me, how am I being impacted, before I'm sort of articulating what it is that that I really want to say, that sort of creates the connection that I'm hoping for. So it can look a lot of different ways. I mean, ways we've talked about it before is some people cannot really put a finger on it. And I think you said something about this before, about people were happy about something about their kids being with Socrates. I'm trying to remember what it was, but it's like they couldn't put their finger on it, but it was just like there was an example of something that was attractive, in that, like, I don't know what it is, but I feel comfortable around you, or I feel safe around you. And this is, even though that's never an active thing that I was ever doing. In fact, I wasn't even being reflected that, oh, you're scary and, stay away from me. But there's a way in which just sort of getting more in touch with who I am, and sort of the deeper truths of reality, my own as well as our shared one, just creates a certain degree of ease in engagement with other people. So, I mean, that's probably one of the biggest ones for me.
I want to zero in on that, because I think that's really astute. Because the opposite, of course, of ease is disease. And so many people have commented who are entered into a space of sort of critiquing where we are at, have talked about this weird, almost paradox, that all the space is disappearing, right? Everything
Mm.
is in your face. Think about how much that is. Everything's in your face, and things are becoming breathless and fast, and there's no time and no space, and everyone's in your face, and at the same time, we feel radically disconnected. So there's a loss of ease and intimacy, if I can put it that way, where ease doesn't mean easy.
Right.
Ease means the sense of not diseased, the sense of things flowing together rather than smashing into each other and things being in your face. And so one of the things that I think people get, at least that's what I found in circling, is how you can get those two together.
Yes.
Like like when you're in circling, you feel intimately connected, deeply connected to people, yet you also feel a spaciousness and an openness. So things are happening at ease rather than being forced or colliding or smashing into each other. And it almost sounds like a paradox from our usual frame of mind, but right, the proposal or the promise is realizing that I don't think I've met anybody, and you have much more experience than I have, but I've never met anybody that's experienced going to that place and saying, no, I prefer the way it was before. Yeah, you see, you laugh, and that's that, like, it's like, wow, it's almost on the border of absurd. It's like, and that's what I mean. It's like a transformation. Don't tell me that you don't want to go to Spain if you've never been to Spain. I've been to Spain and I've been to Canada, and I'll tell you, you should go to Spain. You'll like it, right? Right, that kind of thing. That's the kind of metaphor, right? And so, I guess we're proposing is that there's a real transformation here where you get spacious intimacy, and I want to state it like that because it sounds like a paradox, but you get that spacious intimacy that seems so unavailable to us, and you realize it. And almost universally, I'll put the almost in there because I'll be a scientist, but almost universally, it is preferred over the diseased state that we're currently in. That's the promise at the personal level. Does that ring fair and true to you?
Yeah. I think so. I think earlier we were talking about there's sort of my experience of it, the language I would put to it is there's a rightness of the moment.
Yeah.
It's sometimes hard to articulate, but there's just something that, like, maybe you notice it depending on how somatically aware you are, but there can often just be an ease of being present and in truth with everybody that's sort of there.
Yeah.
And sometimes, and as you said, you name all this thing, there can be all the spaciousness, but there can also be like a void over here that's a little uneasy. Maybe that's like a person, or that's a withhold or something that's happening. And being in that spaciousness gives you an opportunity to sort of reflect and notice that. You can sort of enter into the witness awareness of what's happening in the space. So you can also observe yourself doing the thing that you're doing in this particular space. Like, it can get to some, I'm not promising this for early practitioners, but you can get to sort of this space that almost borders on or verges on a psychedelic experience of a hyper presence and hyper awareness and openness, like a real openness where nothing's really a threat, even the thing that maybe seems a little fuzzy over here. And then you can put your attention on that, like, well, what is it that's over here? And you can engage in that, at least in terms of the interpersonal or the intersubjective, meditative practices like circling. So there's something about the container, the way we set it up, the context, that everybody's there. Like, we have shared reality of what it is we're here for. We have our agreements to sort of help frame how we're going to play the game, although we don't tend to use that term, but how we're going to engage into this particular practice. And that affords a lot of permission for a lot of people who, in an implicit interaction, they don't necessarily, like, the social norms come in and start to tell them, you should be doing this right now. And, well, but I don't want to do that. And you get, and that can happen in this space, but it's a beautiful space for you to, like, wrestle with that with other people, because we're all acknowledging we're gonna, excuse my term, fumble beep, we're gonna fumble fuck our way around, sort of doing that. Like, it's going to be a particularly awkward, but here's a space in which we've all sort of agreed to do it. And we're going to feel probably a myriad of emotions. Conflict, conflict is great. It's great for energy, but you don't want too much, such that starts to become threatening. So it's like, how do we play with that in the space?
Right.
Coherence is great, but if you have too much of it, things start to get a little bit flat.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of experiences that are sort of available when we allow ourselves to be ourselves with one another. Yeah.
So there's a developmental loop between cultivating virtues and virtuosity. You get that virtuosity you were describing, but it feeds back into people acquiring particular virtues of discernment and an orientation towards, the true disclosure, right? And so virtues and virtuosity are training each other, which I think is one of the most powerful things.
Oh, yeah.
So there's so much I mean, there's a couple of things I'd want to say, but I guess we talked about it in the first talk. It's something new. It's not therapy and it's not debate, right? And those are the two things it's not, right? It's not therapy and it's not debate, because therapy and debate are directed towards different ends, and they also presuppose things much more fundamental, the dialogos, that we're actually trying to recognize and become reaware of in these practices. And for me, that points to what I was talking about when I was talking about the sort of philosophical, spiritual import of the course. So I've been talking recently, I tweeted about this. I tweeted at New Year's. I don't generally tweet, but I tweeted at New Year's. And I was also talking to David Fuller about this, and some of it will come out in some work he's going to be doing, about trying to step back and look at these two different fundamental ways in which we could be oriented to the world. And I don't know how they map onto being and having and some of the other fundamentals. So that's still work to come. But it's pertinent for what we're talking about right now, because I talk about and this is based on a phrase from Paul Ricoeur, the hermeneutics of suspicion. This is what we inherited from Freud. There's the therapeutic, by the way, and Marx, which is the economic, and from Nietzsche, and there's the postmodern. So that what we go in is our orientation is fundamentally one of suspicion and distrust. And the moment of truth, the exemplary moment of truth, is the discovery of the conspiracy, of the secret agenda, of the cabal, of the hidden motive, right? And of course, the reason why those were taken up is originally because they were very, very much needed, right? They were undermining a certain orientation we were getting from the Enlightenment and Descartes about certainty and self-presence and all that. There was a critique of modernity, a profound one, developing. Yeah. So I'm not trying to be dismissive of it, but what I'm trying to point out, and this comes from recent people I'm reading, like D.C. Schindler especially, and Clark, and a bunch of other people, Tyson, right? Merleau-Ponty, and Lowe's book on Merleau-Ponty. It's this excellent book on Merleau-Ponty's last vision. And here's the basic idea. The basic idea is that's an attitude towards the relationship between how things are appearing or showing up and reality. And the hermeneutics of suspicion says appearances distort us, distract us, and deceive us from reality. And they of course can do that. They can of course do that. But what Merleau-Ponty and Schindler, and this is ultimately, I think, goes back to Plato, but you only realize something's an illusion if in terms of another experience, you take to be real. You only realize you've been self-deceived, or you have been deceived, if there's a moment of self-correction or realization. Listen to the word, right? So the hermeneutics of suspicion is not self-sustaining. It actually depends on deeper moments, a different hermeneutics, where appearances aren't distorting or distracting or deceiving, but where appearances are disclosing and revealing and connecting to reality. And this is the hermeneutics of beauty, beauty properly understood, not what we've reduced it to. Han's book on saving beauty, we've reduced beauty to what sort of gratifies us, right? Rather than that which can strike us and open us up in ways, right? I recommend Scari's book, Beauty, on beauty and how it prepares you for truth and justice, because where you come to see appearance as, and this is what Bortalt is doing in his book called, what is it, Saving Appearances, I think, or Taking Appearance Seriously. I can't remember the title. It's a great book. I'm reading it right now. And right, so the hermeneutics of beauty is one where the exemplary moment, the moment of truth, is not, aha, there's the cabal, and this is why we should hate it. The exemplary moment of truth is when you and I together, there's a co-emergence of an insight into reality, where the appearances are beautiful, where you, and this happens in these practices, and I want to see if even when I say this, people can hear it, right? Like, you would become beautiful to me. And notice how there's the hackles, right, of cynicism coming up. Oh, right. But try to put that aside and say, no, what if what people are reporting is they reconnect, instead of appearances being mere appearances that bedazzle us, what about appearance as the showing up, the disclosure of deeper reality, and people affording that in each other in a profound way? That's what I mean by the hermeneutics of beauty. And for me, what we do is we disclose a depth of reality that we love, rather than the secret conspiracy that we uncover so that we can hate it and kill it. And what I would put to you is happening in increasing speed is, and this is an irony considering the nature of the hermeneutics of suspicion. The hermeneutics of suspicion has become the default mode of interpretation. It has become the very kind of thing it wanted to challenge, which is an unquestioned default mode of interpretation. That's what the hermeneutics of suspicion was supposed to be always undermining, but it's become the very thing, the very thing it was designed to explicate and call into question. Yeah. And so I think the hermeneutics of suspicion enculturates us to distrust, to be cynical and ultimately nihilistic, and then we react to the starvation and the deprivation that causes to us by an attitude of conquest and dominance, because that's the only form of connection that remains possible. So we get the zero-sum game, the winner take all, the love of victory rather than the love of wisdom, all the things. So I think, and I don't think this is inflationary, I think people truly tasting the hermeneutics of beauty, and that's a way I think of describing a lot of how people report what's happening to them in these practices, right, is what is deeply needed in order for people to wake up to an alternative to the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is getting rapidly just insane and out of control. The speed, the rapidity at which conspiracy theories are being flung at, and people are being demonized, and whole entire groups are being, right, disclosed at, sorry, not that's the wrong word, being portrayed. That's what I want to say. Being portrayed as, this secret narrative, like that. That is, I don't know if this has happened to you, but it's gone from being something I just see out there in social media to interact in, personal relationships. I see it in people I know now, perhaps even in myself, and I'm just blind to it, but I'm trying to get awake to it, right? To the way this like insane mindset. And here's where I think there's a cultural point, and then I'll shut up because I want you to go back to talking. What it's done is it's led, see, the hermeneutics of beauty allows you to pay attention to the beauty of the dance, the beauty of the process. It makes you aware of the fundamental importance of procedural justice, right? That, right, how we do it is as important, if not more important, than what it is we're trying to do. Now, substantive or substantial justice is, this is what I want the world to be, right? It's that kind of view. And I'm not saying we should stop talking about that, but what happens in a hermeneutics of suspicion is we undermine procedural justice for the sake of substantial justice. Let me give you a prototypical example. I was talking to David about this. So in the hermeneutics of beauty, you have a presumption of, listen to the word carefully, you have a presumption of innocence. right? And that what we'll do is, right, we will presume that people are innocent, and we will have, we will have to prove that they are guilty. And we can, right, and because we understand how fallible and finite and self-deceptive we are, but we also understand that people can ultimately be reached in their commitment to what is true, what is good and beautiful, right? Now, there'll be violations on that, and those people will be criminal, et cetera, okay?
Sure.
But now what's happening is we're moving into a hermeneutics of the dominance of the hermeneutics of suspicion, where suspicion is equal to being. So the accusation of something is now gets people fired, they lose their job, they lose their reputation. The presumption of innocence is gone. Like there's been some cases in Canada where people have merely been accused of something, they're in the States too. And it's like, and whether or not they've done it or not, that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is we should claim that we don't know until we do all this hard work, and that we should basically trust people until we have very good reason and evidence to distrust them. But now we're in the opposite position. You've been accused, that's it, you're done. And for me, that's where the hermeneutics of suspicion completely subjugates procedural justice to substantial justice and substantive justice. And that to me is, right, that's the cultural significance that aligns with the philosophical significance. And what we're doing, if you really think about it, I mean, this is kind of I don't mean this to sound childish, but we're really allowing people to return to the presumption of innocence in discourse. And that sounds like, well, no, but we don't. And people have to, like, that space. What I'm proposing to you is the space, the space of spacious intimacy is exactly innocence in that sense, where people are coming into a space where there's a presumption of innocence, not of perfection, not of infallibility, not of certainty, but of innocence. And allowing people to return to that without some romantic, childish notion of innocence, but a profound one that restores our capacity to see and be, so that we can fall in love with each other in the world again. So now I'll shut up. That was a long thing, but for me, there's a philosophical and a cultural significance of what you're proposing in this course that really needs to be put center stage.
Yeah. Wow. So thank you. That's beautiful to go on this journey with you as you sort of explicate this. With simultaneously a lot of anxiety as you sort of talk about the default mode that I perceive, that we're both perceiving, that's out there of suspicion. I feel like I allowed myself to touch a little bit into maybe what might be our collective trauma around that. So a part of me is a bit upset. And then another part of me, and it's a way in which you sort of explicate and exemplify as you're talking. So there's this other way, as you talk about the beauty, I can sort of dip into that with you. And I can also feel the beauty that I'm imagining that you're invoking as you talk about it. So it's quite a ride to sort of go with you. So it was lovely. And I think it's a beautiful frame that you have. And I think it's very apt. I think one way that I would map some of that onto the way in which I've tended to do this work or these practices is that I would call them sort of good faith. We enter into practices in good faith. So that is probably the part, that maps onto the presumption of innocence. And yet one of the things about our practice is that we are not so rigid such that there is a particular direction in which we go. At least in circling, we tend to work with emergence a lot. So in circling, we'll tend to give space and allowance for suspicion, allowance for judgment, but to work with it together, to be in relationship together about how we're impacted as that's being arrived. So we really work with the pieces that you're talking about that maybe allow us to free ourselves from them, such that collectively this is happening. And like you said, you think maybe you're doing it too and you're not aware, and I'm aware of the ways in which I move into reactivity and see something, and it's a lot easier to turn around and demonize that because I don't have the time and space and the inclination to actually know everybody. And there's that part in me that wants to just always say, you know, project love, but I also am working on trying to trust my actual experience and not
Yes,
override it,
yes,
you know.
yeah, yes,
So
yes,
it's very much a dance,
yeah,
and
yeah,
sometimes we're clumsy in that dance. But you know, like anything, the more you practice, the better dancer you're going to become.
yeah,
You know.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Discernment takes a lot of practice. And I wasn't, I did say I wasn't trying to give like a romantic notion of just,
Mhm.
you know, loving everybody, although, you know, Jesus of Nazareth said ultimately you can get to that place. But uh, there we used to think about the beautiful that way. We used to think of the beautiful as it can call me out of myself without, it can call to me deeply personally without triggering all my personal projects. You can get this place where I can step outside the prison of my own ego for a bit, right? And the thing is, I guess another way of putting it is the we space is an innocent space in that people can step outside of their own ego, and they might have to do that by first confronting, you know, suspicion and you know, and self-aggrandizement and all the stuff we are wont to do. And
Mhm.
but that they can step into a space and find that that space is in some appropriate sense welcoming, right?
Yes.
It's a space that will in which their caring will be met by caring.
Mhm.
um
Yes. Totally. I mean, you know, we have for the facilitators, we have sort of principles, and our first principle is to welcome everything. And
right,
that's our very first principle to sort of indicate whether or not we are doing the practice of circling. Different organizations have different orders and structures of their principles, but for us, and that doesn't mean to embrace it wholeheartedly and hug it and love the hell out of it and project
yeah,
love and light onto it. It's to welcome that, you know, this person's truth, the perspective is real and valid for them, you know, and that is the sort of the, you know, that is the extending of regard to somebody, that like what you were experiencing is real and valid for you. And whether it's objectively valid or not, that's even not the thing that we're doing in circling. We're not really interested in that. We're really trying to step into your world, to be with you in your world, to see what it's like. You know, we use sort of this metaphor, if you try somebody on as a suit and sort of look through their eyes, how do you see and perceive the world? And this process that I've been doing for a number of years, you know, I think, I
yeah.
don't know the exact quote from Guy, but it's this idea that, you know, you go through this experience and you come out of it and the world occurs to you as a little bit different.
It's
And
the
you
recovery theory of
enter.
Tolkien.
Yes,
Exactly. It's
exactly.
the recovery theory, right? So
Yeah.
the idea is, and this is the multi-perspectival virtuosity and the set of virtues that undergird it, right? That's the key in the wisdom consensus paper, this multi-perspectival ability. So when I go to another perspective, this was Tolkien's idea of fantasy. It's like the anthropologist that goes to another culture. You put on another glasses, another, you inhabit, and think of the
Mhm.
monk's habit, right? You put
Yep.
on a different habit, you go over there, and then when you come back and you see your own world renewed, you recover it, it discloses itself. Yes,
Exactly.
and that's what I mean about that's what I mean about this, a beauty that is tied to disclosure, right?
Yes.
It's not it, because what it's not sort of psychological, being a psychological dilettante. Oh, I'll try a bit of Susie on for a while, and I'll try a bit of Mac on for a while, and I'll try a bit of Peter and a bit of Andrea on for a while, and I'll just sort of consume the one that I find most gratifying.
Right.
That is a total misframing of what we're talking about here right
Yes.
now. It is not that consumerist dilettante attitude now projected into perspectives,
Yeah.
right? It's a very, very different attitude at all. It's about, like, it's about, can you undergo a transformation of the other that allows you to recover yourself and them and your shared world in a new and profound way?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a very much the heart of it, is sort of the coming back to knowing of being in some
Yes.
way. Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, a way that I've looked at it recently, since, you know, watching and listening to a lot of what you're saying, is enter in these experiences and something often can happen that breaks my frame of reality.
Yes. Yes.
such that when I come out and sort of process it, it gives me this opportunity to reshape and reframe my perspective on reality.
Exactly.
So it's constantly that modal reciprocal shaping that's happening of myself to the other, right? I
Yeah.
think you talked about it in terms of like the mother to the child,
Yeah.
right? And sort of affording the agape, and in the way in which it comes back into it starts to reshape the framing of reality for, you know, for the mother. But I mean, it's happening for everybody when we're in this kind of real relationship, this real, as you refer to it, I think a covenant of reciprocal opening,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
where we're
Yes.
exchanging, and we're here, we're now, we're exploring what's here, we're welcoming everything, including what's uncomfortable, including the beautiful.
Yes.
And often what's uncomfortable is really beautiful, which is a
Yes.
really,
Yes.
again, it can be this really, the word's not coming to me right now, but it, you know, it's not what you would expect, you know, to
Yes.
be able to sit in discomfort with somebody else and then come out and go, wow, that was really cool. And I don't
Yeah.
understand it. I don't understand why that was, you know, that because there's
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
aliveness that can sort of happen. And I think that goes back to you saying, like, it brings us, you know, the recovery is bringing us back in touch with our true nature, in a way in which we're not really doing that in the discourse that, you know, you were talking about before. I think it's much more reactionary.
Yep.
And we are just more or less, you know, feeding off of that particular energy because it's the easier thing to do, and nobody's really taught us. I mean, nobody taught me how. I mean, I
Yeah.
was 30. I was 35 before I came
Yeah.
to any of this particular. It completely changed my perspective on other people, on relationships, on what's possible in relationship and love. I had 35 years of default mode, game A, you know,
Yeah.
reacting to life is happening to me. And then this just puts so much more power into my access, like within my grasp of, you know, was sometimes referred to as self-authoring. It gave me this opportunity to sort of break out of the socialized mind and start to actually self-author and notice, like, oh, I really like that, and oh, I really don't like that. Not what society's telling me to like and not like.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like actually deeply in touch with my body, and I can feel how I feel when I'm doing this, and I'm trusting that that feeling is good,
Mm, mm.
and I'm trusting that this uncomfortable thing is not good. But I'm not just always succumbing to that, not always surrendered to that. You know,
Yeah.
it's information I still have to sense make, I still have to process, because there can be ways in which I'm deceiving myself in
Yeah.
either end of
Yeah.
this, right?
Yes. Yes.
So that is a big part of why, yes, we've got the practice, but we're also trying to bring in the sense making of really trying to process those experiences together. Like, hey, is what I felt in that experience the same as what you felt?
Excellent.
Interesting. They're different. Why are they different? You know, and then
Yeah.
we can sort of talk about, we perceive what might be different, you know, like, oh, I was really anxious and actually I thought you didn't like me. Oh, wow. I wonder why that happened. We can have our experience, but then we can also have another experience as we look back on that experience that helps us get, I think, a little bit closer to objective truth,
Right.
which is really hard when you're dealing with, you know, subjective human beings. You know,
But it's possible. That's the point. It is
yes,
possible.
of
It is
course. Yeah,
possible.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, the pursuit is fun.
I wanted to move a little bit back now towards the practical. Or just keep moving between them. So I've been I coined a slogan that what distraction is to meditation, projection is to dialogos. That it's the thing that can derail it. But you're not trying to push distraction out of your mind in meditation. Right. You're trying to learn to acknowledge it, but not get consumed by it and step aside from it. And then eventually you can also meditate on the distractions, because they reveal very powerful habits of mind, right? And the same thing right here. This is not like, so again, a little bit more, because you started this by saying what you got out of this is you weren't sort of automatically projecting, right? And projection and suspicion are just two sides of the same coin, right? So in what way does this course and this pedagogical program of practices address the issue of projection? Is there some shadow work going on, or are there practices that get you to, again, to sort of, again, no, I'm never going to project that, like that. No,
Yeah,
that,
no.
it's like, right, exactly. So it's,
Yeah.
that's why I use I think it's a very strong analogy of distraction in meditation. Like, you're going to constantly get called to projection, and you have to constantly call each other out of it again and again and again and again, and even note what, you know, what the attraction to the projection might be saying about you and about the situation. So are there practices in the course for dealing with that? The reason I ask is that, and this is a point that Chris has been making, Chris Masterpietro, to myself, but also to Guy Senstock, is that the dialectic into dialogos practice needs to incorporate some shadow work, needs to incorporate this dealing with projection. And I've been also talking to Chloe Valdery about that, you know, theory of enchantment, because she does shadow boxing and some other work about that. And so this is something that I'm very keen on right now, because here's what I don't think we can do. While you're going to go through a long program of therapy so that you can deal with your projections, and then you can do this practice, because if we do this, no one will do this practice. First of all, they'll either not do the therapy, or they'll get stuck in therapy. And so again, I don't like this adjective, but how do you see, and I know this is experimental and it's something we're working on too, and we're working on together. How do we bring in, like, there's, you know, following the breath was a developed practice for dealing with distractions, and labeling the process rather than getting involved with the content was how you right, it was a way of getting the right optimal grip on your distractions that allowed you to return to the mindful state, right?
Totally.
So what do you see? I know this is a loaded question, and it's very much a work in progress. And so I'm not going to pin you to some Cartesian standard of, I want the algorithm here, right? It's just, what are your thoughts, right? Really open-ended. What are your thoughts about how, in a practical manner that avoids, right, just falling into projection within debate, or just, I'm going to analyze you forever within therapy? How can we practically, that horrible sounding neologism, how can we dance with projection?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few ways we could sort of tackle that. I think the way that it tends to happen in sort of the ecology of practices that art has always been engaged in historically, and now adding on a few others with this particular course, there's something about doing this work within a group and doing it within that space, such that there's certain types of modalities you can do with other people, and then there's modalities you're doing in relationship with other people. And there's something about the period of being in relationship, and where we have our agreements here that we're basically not going to gaslight one another, that we're going to speak plainly. The only pitfall, if we just follow that, is you could fall into groupthink, and the whole group could deceive itself. So that is a potential pitfall to that particular, just relying on the general process to sort itself out, sort of the chaos order flip. However, in my experience, it works quite potently, such that invariably somebody in the group or multiple people in the group will not be on board with what is currently happening. And because of the structure that we set up, there's a strong invitation. In some ways, it's almost an agreement and expectation that we actually voice where we're at right now. You know what, I'm feeling really angry with what you just said. This isn't lining up for me, you know, and that's one way in which you can, you know, here's how I'm impacted by something that you're saying, you know. And we have sort of this saying about, you know, these reflections, that they're information. And if one person says you're a horse, you might think, well, that's strange, I'm not a horse. If two people say you're a horse, you might be like, geez, I've heard that before, but I'm pretty sure I'm not a horse. But if three people say you're a horse, you might want to look around and see if you're standing in a barn. So there's just a general way of discourse where we're inviting everybody into self-awareness, and then also inviting that group collaborative sense making, sort of post-processing of these experiences, that I think will tease a lot of those self-deceptions out. And we do active shadow work. I have run work groups on going through the 3-2-1 integral shadow process, which is an amazingly potent process that it's more potent in a group, but you can also do it yourself. And that is a practice that we will certainly be introducing into the course.
Excellent.
For us, for me, at least, one of the, I don't know about changes, because it doesn't, I'm not trying to say anything about the way in which art was run, but we started to make some of more of the implicit explicit. And one thing was bringing in a particular frame that would inform us as what
Taylor,
is
can I just interrupt for a sec?
Yeah.
Taylor's invoking art. That means authentic relating Toronto, just so you know. He's not invoking artwork, art, authentic relating Toronto. Just sorry, I wanted to get that out before people, what's he talking about?
Sorry. yeah, years of this, it comes so easily. So one of the frameworks that we've been using is Dustin DePerna and Ken Wilber wrote a white paper called Towards Deliberately Developmental Civilizations. And it's about 16 pages, something like that. And this really calls on to, the previous structure. I don't know if it was Wilber or not, but of wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. But this is a little bit more simplistic, but I think fits much better and is a huge reason of why I'm plugged into your perspective and what you brought forward with Awakening from the Meaning Crisis is that, to have wholeness, it's a term that's wrought with some discomfort, but the idea of a whole thing is that you need to have an integration of structures of consciousness, of states of consciousness, and you have to reintegrate the shadow. And if any one of these things are missing, there are sort of cracks that can sort of allow the self-deception to go in. So in the paper, they invoke the idea of the Nazi doctor. Here you have a doctor's taken on an oath, and yet they belong to, so it's like there's a crack because something is not being integrated into their ecology of practices. So we are working with the structure, we're bringing theory, we're explaining how this works, we're bringing in the procedural, we're working with states, obviously through the participatory and the perspectival. That's kind of the spiritual end of things. And then we're checking ourselves with the shadow work, like, hey, what's going on here? Where am I reactive? What's that about? And, we have an opportunity to explore that, to hopefully bring it to light. And then if you go through some shadow work process, you might actually be able to reintegrate that which you have dissociated from, and you say, that's not me. And it's like, oh, actually it is me. So there are processes to sort of help us do that along the way.
That's good, because one of the, they're related, these two moments that occur, I'm noticing, is that really, to me, seem to be markers of projection. One is, I've always known this, what you're teaching me. I've always known it. It's like, I'm a little bit worried about that. I mean, there, like, if there's this sort of like if you're seeing, right, I've always known, it's like, that's usually for me as a marker that I don't know. If there's no novelty, if there's no genuine novelty and emergence, that sounds to me like projections going on. You're just reading in, you're completely assimilating this to an existing schema. The other is, oh, that I just don't get that. That's all just so much blah, blah, blah. So there's the dismissive move. And that's also, that I noticed that shows up for some people in this. And it's like, again, okay, that's also projective. That's right. It's an inverse projection. It's a claiming to know completely that has no value, right? Do you understand what I'm trying to point to? When we're talking about projection, you might not think it is where you think it is, right? Like you might think, oh, I'm not projecting because I'm in so much agreement, but that can be dangerous, right? And you might think, oh, I'm not projecting because I just know that's all bullshit. It's like, actually, so one of the sneaky things about projection is it's often most at work where you least suspected of being at work, if I can put it that way, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, well, what I would say there, we have a particular agreement when we do circling, and that agreement is to own your experience. So you're
Yeah,
using first, it becomes more of a serious play of sort of
yeah,
looking at the way in which you frame your assertions. Basically, the idea is not to assert anything, is
yeah,
to check everything with the other person to see whether or not it fits their experience. So
yes,
you can have this reframing or paraphrasing that comes back. What I heard was this. Does that fit? Yes or no? And then we start to see the
yeah,
distinctions in
yeah,
your
yeah,
expression and my
yeah,
understanding.
yeah, yeah,
So that helps, if we engage in that process, that helps to eliminate a certain degree of projection. And then there's the ways in which we can sort of sit in the space and somebody says something and you can say, wow, that's so brave. And it's like, well, maybe it's not, maybe
yeah,
they
yeah,
do that all the time. And it doesn't, to you, it's brave. To them, they feel cowardly by doing it. They feel
yeah,
like they're avoiding something. So when we sort of make these projections and we assert something, we're missing something about the other person. So baked into our agreements of circling and the way in which we engage in it is really to check with the other person to see if it fits. And in some ways, it's like a very light version of steel manning. In some way, we can
yeah,
go into
yeah,
that
yeah,
process of
yeah,
I heard this. Does this fit what because we have our own language, we have our own way of saying things, and it
yeah,
lands in us, and we usually formulate it in a slightly different language. So that paraphrasing that tends to
yeah,
happen in this
yeah,
practice gives us an opportunity to see, is there something futzy here with my interpretation? Is there something futzy with your expression? But we're not going to know until you express and I interpret, and when we turn around and see
excellent,
whether or not we meet
excellent,
each other. So I would say that particular piece is already baked into my
yeah.
experience of circling and how I've been practicing it for the last almost 9 years now.
No, that's good. I like this idea about sort of slowing down the process of attribution and
Mhm.
looking for agreement in attribution before you move into any kind of wrestling with the
Yeah.
content. And that's very analogous to dealing with the distraction. You don't get involved with the content, you step back and look at the process itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's
True.
very, very good. That's very good.
Yeah. I've
Excellent.
never thought of it that way, but that's what's happening.
Yeah, that's
What's
very good.
happening. Yeah.
Like, yeah, really get, yeah, that part of doing that. Uh, yeah, that's in the dialectic and the dialogos, but it's got to be beefed up a bit. It's got to be it's strengthened a bit and bring in some of these other practices of specific shadow work. So that's
Mhm.
been very helpful. Thank you for that, Taylor. I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited about this whole project.
Yeah.
Uh, we're sort of coming to the end of our time together. I want to give you the chance to do the final word. Take as much time as you want. Like, I think we've done a good job on how this can be personally, philosophically, and culturally relevant to you, and what promises. And I think people get a good sense of the combination of authenticity and expertise that you're bringing to this. And so, but is there anything more that should be said that you'd like to put out as a sort of a final word on this?
Mm. Now, my inclination is to simply say, if you've been following John's work for a while, I finally finished the 50 episode Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. It took me way longer than it should have. But finally coming to the end of it, there was just that real settling. I was very emotional about it, but there's a real settling in sort of the things that you were saying about how we can respond and address the meaning crisis. And for me, the emotion is like, okay, I'm on the right track.
Right.
you know
Right.
and I mean, that might sound, I don't know how else to say it, but my felt experience is one of like, there's an affirmation. Obviously there's a confirmation bias, but I don't think there's been any particular shadow there. I've done a number of things throughout the years and I get really involved in them and I sort of drop them. This is not that thing. There is
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
so integrated and so true that continues to allow me to see and witness more truth, good, and beauty, more elegance in the world, more beauty in one another. Even when I'm angry with
Yep.
somebody, I
Yep.
still have
Yeah.
the perspective
Isn't that
to,
amazing?
yeah,
Like when you're like, that's been new for me too recently, right? Over the past couple of years, like, right. I can be angry and yet the beauty can shine through, and it shakes me out of the projective narrowing that anger can do. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but that I just wanted to
beautiful.
reinforce how powerful that experience can be.
Yeah. Yeah, I just, and for me, when we had our first conversation in your office, for me, it really comes back to like, this is ideally what I would like to be doing. I'd like to be working on creating a pedagogy that sort of helps us move through these things, and I
Yep,
hold a
exactly.
developmental perspective, and I see that, socially we're sort of stuck in this particular
Yeah,
area of development, and I'm seeing mostly the shadow. I mean, I'm maybe a little too sensitive to it or a little too
yeah,
attuned to it. I see mostly the shadow happening, because even where people aren't engaging with the shadow, they seem almost to me to be regressive a bit more because it's way too confrontational over here. So for me, I just feel the tension. I feel like I'm
yeah.
constantly in it and living and witnessing the tension. Fortunately, I don't feel like I'm alone. Thank you, John, and everybody else that's doing this work. It does help sort of alleviate, some of the tension of like, oh my God, this is all mine, this weird narcissistic tension, like it's all mine to work with. It's like, no, there's a bunch of us here that want to really, we're perceiving and sort of seeing the roadblock or the bottleneck, and
Yeah,
we have a pretty good sense of, especially, as you articulated, like, here's where we were, and here's the cognitive science aspect of it. It's kind of leading us to here, and I didn't get to that place through your process and lens. Through, I got to it through this highly subjective,
yeah,
experiential,
yeah,
coming into deep contact of what it means to be, I guess what I think it means to be human.
yeah.
Still ever disclosing. So yeah, I mean, it's a really long-winded way of saying that, I think what you have articulated as maybe our best way through this contraction in meaning, is to engage with these what word do I want to use? These introspective self, coming into deep contact with ourselves, with virtue. And then for me now, I see the next step is to really bring the sense making part into it so that we're not deceiving ourselves. It's
Yes,
so
yeah,
easy
yeah,
to stay in the good,
yeah,
juicy, feel good feelings of being with people and seeing everyone. And that's important. And some people need that just to be able to even step outside of anything else because they're so contracted there. Um, I just see this as the next stage to sort of help us ease out of our self-deception, such that when we start to make change in the world, when we want to make systemic changes, these are going to be sustainable changes, at
yes,
least for the
yes,
foreseeable future, and not the past, which seems to have been regressive, more
yeah.
totalitarian, is the winner, sort of power dynamics that tend to have created what we currently have. And yeah, I mean, I feel really fumbly with my words right now.
It was beautiful though. It was really beautiful. Like your deep uh involvement, interest I originally meant to be within. You're being within it, and
Yeah,
you're making it very interesting to people, to me, and I assume to people who are watching. So I think that was excellent. Thank you very much for that.
thanks, John. Yeah,
Um, so I just wanted to thank you. This will not be our final conversation. We'll, of course, we'll do another one of these. This will be ongoing. And I just wanted to thank you again. Remind everybody, Taylor's going to give me any information. It'll be put in the notes for this. So I'll be there for some of this course, and I strongly recommend this. Many of you are asking, okay, what do we do beyond talking? Well, this is what you can do beyond talking. This is really what you can do. This is how we can start talking that leads to changing.
yeah,
And if that's the talking that leads to transformation rather than just the talking about transformation is what you're looking for, this is a good place to start.
yeah. This is the participatory for sure. Yeah.